Hi folks, welcome back to your recorded lectures for ML103. This is Studying Medievalism in Digital Games, the Basics. So a little bit more theory and conceptual stuff, and then I'll give you a bit of an introduction to our case study games in the next two lectures. So our key questions for this lecture: how should we approach studying medievalism in the context of digital games? How does the genre or type of game influence the nature of its medievalism? How should we evaluate gaming's relationship to medieval history? And what influence did Dungeons and Dragons have on medievalist games? The answer to that, the short answer, is a lot. Now, very few medievalist games are rigorous adaptations of actual medieval history. In fact, the games that are closest to medieval history, specifically strategy games like the Crusader Kings series, are actually focused on changing that history by manipulating variables to take your chosen kingdom in a direction it didn't actually go in history. You're playing with the raw material of history, experimenting with counterfactuals. That's the whole point of the strategy game. Now, I'm not that much of a strategy game person myself, but I've seen the glee that people get, having Byzantium conquer the world or something similar. Now, in most cases, the medieval material that's taken and used by digital games is reimagined. And I don't mean just the neo-medieval games that are more fantasy than reality. Think about it this way. In strategy games, in RPGs, in MMORPGs, basically any of the genres that demand a more complex game world, if you're going to make that game world medieval in its flavor, it's not just the history that you're drawing on, and it's not just the narrative where you see those influences. We see medievalism in a game's audio, in its visuals, in its haptic elements, in its kinesthetic elements, in the very mechanics of the game. Translating the medieval to a digital game is a complicated process. Even if you're adapting real history, it's almost always a transformative process, at least to a degree. You are always transforming the medieval for a contemporary audience. A game is going to address our interests, our questions, our beliefs, not those of medieval people. Now, you might call medievalist and neo-medievalist games post-medieval, in that they share a heritage with medieval traditions, but they're not part of that tradition. They build upon and expand beyond it. So I'm going to give you some more quotes in this particular lecture, because they're good for getting you thinking about some of these concepts. So this is from the introduction written by Richard Utz to neo-medievalism in the media. Neo-medieval texts no longer strive for the authenticity of original manuscripts, castles, or cathedrals, but create pseudo-medieval worlds that playfully obliterate history and historical accuracy, sorry, bit of a misspelling there, and replace history-based narratives with simulacra of the medieval, employing images that are neither an original nor the copy of an original, but altogether neo. Just think about that for a minute. There's no accuracy any longer. It's all a simulacra. It's a blending, a playful blending of different elements in an ahistorical way. I don't know that I always agree with that, but certainly it's true in some cases. Now, as I mentioned when I talked about neo-medievalism originally, there's a lot of debate over whether or not we should even use the term. Certainly one of the areas in which people do use it more often is to talk about gaming, simply because it's thought to be particularly appropriate. So in the end, how important is historical accuracy? We get caught up in historically themed entertainment with the concept of accuracy. How many times have you seen jokes about historians being nitpickers about historical movies, for instance? But the question that medievalism studies asks is, so what? Medievalist texts in most cases aren't trying to be accurate. Neo-medieval texts have no interest at all in accuracy, and that doesn't make them somehow less than a historically oriented text. It makes them apples instead of oranges. That's the only difference. Neo-medievalist texts, as Amy Kaufman mentioned in that quote I gave you from her article back in last week's lectures, are a sort of doubled type of medievalism. They are a dream of someone else's medievalism. They look back to the medieval originals, but they do it through intermediate sources. So you get mediation through other sources like Dungeons and Dragons, and we'll talk a little bit more about D&D shortly. Before that, though, I do want to introduce you to the concept of a palimpsest. So a palimpsest is a particular type of manuscript where the ink of the original manuscript has been scraped off, because you can do that with vellum. You can always reuse vellum by scraping off what was originally there. So a palimpsest does that, where a new scribe reuses an old piece of vellum. But the fascinating thing about the palimpsest is that you can often see, even with the naked eye, traces of the original text. And with some of our new scanning technologies, oftentimes the original text, the ghost text, can be brought back in electronic form. So the writer Michael Alexander says that adaptations as a whole are like palimpsests. They are inherently palimpsestuous works, haunted at times by their adapted texts. So, it's a bit broad to say the Middle Ages are a text that has been adapted, but there's a certain degree of truth to that, I would argue. Now, it's a particularly good term to use in the context of a neo-medieval game because you can look and see the traces of earlier stories and cultural material. You can see the way the new text is built atop the old. Now, there's a concept called adaptive novelty. So this is why, for instance, we have so many different ways of retelling the story of King Arthur and his knights. You want to find something new and fresh, but something that still feels Arthurian. So it's this sort of layering that we see in neo-medieval games. They use the medieval to lend familiarity to their plot lines, to their characters, to romanticize their settings, to give a sense of authority to their game worlds. But neo-medievalism can be a little dangerous at times. Amy Kaufman also points out that it is sometimes in danger of colonizing the past. And by this she means it takes symbols of non-Western cultures, it strips them of cultural baggage, and it incorporates them into Western European landscapes. How many times, for instance, have you played a medieval game and you used what is distinctly a katana? The mixing of armors and weaponry, a lot of which has symbolic meaning in other cultures, is a very common thing. All right, neo-medievalism is a form of medievalism integrally linked to late 20th and 21st century advances of technology and distinguished from previous forms of medievalism by its multiculturalism, its lack of concern for history, and its habit of imagining the medieval through the lens of previous medievalisms. So this is from an article called Neo-Medievalism and 11th Little Middle Ages, where Corey Lowell-Gruel actually makes the argument that neo-medievalism is a perfect term to use when talking about gaming, because it's specifically suited to an electronic form of medievalism. I like a lot of things about this definition, except the bit about the lack of concern for history. I actually think that neo-medievalist texts are concerned with history. They're just not concerned with accuracy. I'm actually in the process of working out some theoretical ideas about that I haven't published on them yet. Well, I've published a little bit on them yet, but we've got to do some more, I think. So this is Pugh and Weisel again. Reimaginings of the Middle Ages are essentially fantasies built on fantasies. For many medievalisms draw more firmly from medieval ideas about fictionality than they do from medieval history. I'm not sure I 100% agree with this either. I would perhaps rephrase the last as draw more firmly from fictional ideas about the medieval world than they do from accurate medieval history. Here's the thing about medievalism studies. It was born out of literary studies. And this is not me trying to be offensive to English majors. I love many English majors. My current coordinator is a wonderful English professor, for instance. But it does lead to a certain amount of myopia. I don't think that medievalism theory has quite fully understood the relationship of medievalism to history, to the craving for authenticity. They keep writing it off, and I don't think that's the right thing to do. There is a yearning for authenticity, if not for accuracy. Again, if a medievalist game world doesn't feel medieval, it's not convincing and you're not going to be immersed in it. And if it's an open world RPG, you need to be immersed in it if it's going to work for you. All right, so some additional considerations about games and history. We have to acknowledge games are always going to sacrifice historical accuracy, even when they claim it, and they will do this for the sake of a more satisfying gameplay experience. So let's take Skyrim for an example. Skyrim has a lot of everyday things in it. So for instance, you can collect cabbages, right? That's how you earn a little bit of money. You can do what seems like daily acts in order to sort of help support yourself, but there's very little of that when it comes right down to it. You know, you're much more likely to go outside the towns and raid the nearest tomb to find treasure. The towns will have examples of everyday technology and everyday economy. So in Riverwood, for instance, you've got the mill, but there's no sign that anybody ever works at the mill. You know, where does the wood come from? Who gathers the wood? These are things that medievalist games are not usually concerned with because they tend to focus on the heroic aspect of all of this. Kevin Moberly, who is one of the great medievalism and games scholars, inspired me enormously, once told me a funny story about how he figured that the most accurate, imaginable medievalist game would be a peasant simulator. And he said nobody would ever want to play it except him. I don't know. I would probably try it at least a couple times. It's certainly not something you would spend 100 hours at, definitely. But really, this is the wrong way to look at it. We don't care about accuracy. Think about it, too. History is not just a list of things that has happened. History is a story that the historian tells about the past. It's an act of actively remembering the past. In the context of digital games, historical accuracy is not as important as historical authenticity. It's not about what games get right or wrong. It is about whether they allow the player to interact with a medieval world that feels authentic. And I would argue we also have to accept that popular media plays an outsized role in how our society's understanding of history is constructed. The media and professional historians have often failed to recognize the impact of popular forms of history, like a historical video game, simply because they worry that such representations are inevitably going to be inaccurate. And yeah, okay, they are. But games still make meaning out of the past. They still engage with larger historical discourse. You know, we're going to be spending an awful lot of time talking about Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and frankly, historiography basically oozes from its pores, metaphorically speaking. There is some serious research work done there. Now, did they interpret what they researched in the way that a historian would? Absolutely not, in a lot of cases. But that doesn't mean that it's not built into the DNA of the game, you might say. Now, the interesting question is not whether games are historically accurate. It's how they interpret and make use of history, and why they make the choices that they do. Now, I want to introduce you to a concept that I came up with in one of my first articles I published. I called it the patchwork world. So this is a neo-medieval game world where medieval influences appear without consideration for their original geographical, temporal, or cultural separation, but where this blurring of boundaries is actually a constructive act. It's one designed to increase player immersion, because everywhere you turn, you recognize something as medieval. Is it jumbled? Yes. We've already established that the relationship between neo-medieval text and medieval source of inspiration is always going to be fragmented and indirect, but it does have meaning. Think about it. When you're creating a game, everything you insert into the game world costs. It costs time, it costs energy, it costs processing power. You don't just throw stuff in randomly. Everything has to have a role, everything has to have meaning. What that meaning is, that may be the more interesting question, but it's there. It's not just random, it's not careless, it's designed that way. All right, let's talk about D&D. So, disclaimer, first of all, I am, what do we call it? What's the term? The forever DM with my gaming group. I've been playing D&D for only a few years now, but I really took to it. I love it a lot. I would love to do a whole course on it, frankly. I'm still thinking about how I would pitch that to medieval studies. So some quick history about D&D. So it is a tabletop role-playing game. It was first published in 1974. In fact, it was the first modern tabletop RPG, and it makes use of statistical charts and dice to help determine outcomes. It introduced the element of chance into combat and other encounters, but also focused on playing an individual character. So for 46 years, it has evolved through multiple editions, culminating so far in the 5th edition from 2015, which has been incredibly popular. I would actually say its cultural impact has been explosive. We're talking about something like 40 million people currently playing D&D. Now, that said, it has not displaced or reduced the demand for digital games. I would argue that it probably appeals to the same basic audience. But digital games are a different experience. They are restricted by the limits of their programming as well, whereas D&D provides its game master, the DM or dungeon master, and the players the freedom to adapt and improvise. It also introduces a social element that most digital RPGs don't have. Even MMORPGs don't have the same level of collaborative storytelling. So basically my point here is new technology does not displace old. And D&D and digital games, they have sort of a happy coexistence, I would argue. Now, I would argue that the reason for this is that digital games, medievalist games, owe a great deal to D&D. This is not a popular opinion. Now, there's been relatively little actual scholarly work done on D&D, which is a shame, frankly. One of the few people who's written on it says that D&D's secondary world is based primarily on the fantasy genre. He calls it a closed system and says it deforms historical influences to maintain the integrity of the fantastical secondary world. And you certainly cannot argue that the original creator of D&D was heavily influenced by fantasy. That's Gary Gygax. He was clear about that. He actually listed his sources of inspiration in what he called Appendix N of the first Dungeon Master's Guide. But this modern author, this scholar, doesn't see the very obvious form of medievalism that animates D&D. Specifically, we see it in the established campaign settings, in most of them, I would argue, but especially in the Forgotten Realms themselves. So if you read the Dungeon Master's Guide, it talks about the Forgotten Realms, the original D&D campaign setting, as a world where, quote, technology and society are based on medieval norms, though the culture isn't necessarily Europe. The guide lays out a set of core assumptions about the Forgotten Realms that only reinforce this. In a D&D game world, the ruins and the remnants of past civilizations are part of the landscape. Settlements can be isolated, long-distance travel is rare for the majority. History is shaped by factional conflicts of various sorts. And these assumptions reflect common perceptions about the nature of the medieval world. Now, another way of looking at the fundamental role of medievalism in core D&D world building, there are connections in a section in the guide on mapping the campaign. DMs are told that most settlements or villages involved in agriculture. Towns are situated near trade routes or key industries like mines. Cities with a population greater than 25,000 are rare but powerful. I'm just going to read you a quote here. In the feudal society common to D&D worlds, power and authority are concentrated in towns and cities. Using this sort of pseudo-feudal structure means the DM can use local authorities to design lower stakes quests for beginning adventurers who need to gain experience points. It's very easy to kill a level 1 character, for instance. Now, in this case, the medieval flavor actually serves the game mechanics. The group of adventurers, the party, even shares some characteristics with the popular image of the medieval warband. Now, the precise historical nature of the medieval warband is debated, but the existence of warrior institutions that are bound together by loyalty, by reciprocal exchange, has a lot of support in various Northern European cultures. Now, there's rarely a clear leader amongst an adventuring party, unlike the warband, which always had a lord. But the party does face combat together. They bond on the field of battle. They look out for each other. Oftentimes the party's healer, who's usually not always a cleric, is a valued member of the group. They share in the spoils, just like the ideal for the warband was. Now, D&D, I would argue, is the direct ancestor of the medievalist RPGs of the 21st century. Their underlying assumptions about the nature of a medieval world, the way they characterize player characters and their development, the role of NPCs, and even basic game mechanics are directly inherited from tabletop D&D and its digital offshoots. And by that I'm talking about, well, there's actually a very long history of digital games based on D&D. Some of the more famous, however, are things like Baldur's Gate, that series. All right, so that takes us through the last of our theory. Stay tuned. I will give you some introductions to our case study games. Thanks very much, guys.